The lights of Nexus Prime flickered, like dying stars across the massive trade station that floated in the void between galaxies. In the most expensive gambling hall on level 700, alien nobility gathered around tables made from crystallized time itself. The air smelled of exotic spices and the fear of losing fortunes. Lady Zephyra sat at the center table like a queen on her throne. Her silver skin caught the light and threw it back in patterns that hurt human eyes to look at. She was Valdorian aristocracy from the core worlds, where money flowed like water and life was cheap. Her crystalline eyes never showed mercy or kindness. They only showed hunger for more power and more wealth. Behind her chair stood Lyra. The elf girl was the most beautiful creature in the known galaxy, and the most valuable slave in the sector. Her hair was like spun gold, and her skin was pale as moonlight. She wore simple white robes that made her look like an angel, but the metal collar around her neck told everyone what she really was: property, a thing to be owned and used. Lyra had been taken from her forest world 3 years ago, when the slave ships came. She watched her people die and her trees burn. Now she served Sephora and healed the wounds of anyone her master told her to heal. Her magic was strong, but her spirit was broken. She stood silent and still, like a statue, while the aliens played their games. The other players at the table were just as cruel as Zephyra. There was Ambassador Kexala from the Sereth Empire. She looked like a giant snake that had learned to walk on 2 legs. Her scales were green and black, and her tongue flicked out to taste the air for lies. She was known across the galaxy for her cunning and her cruelty. Lord Vexter was there too. He came from a world where the gravity was 10 times stronger than most places. His muscles bulged under his armor, and his 4 arms could crush steel. He owned mining colonies, where thousands of slaves died every day, digging for rare metals. He laughed whenever someone mentioned the death counts from his operations. The game they played was called Fate and Fortune. Each player bet on events happening in the real world: wars, plagues, the rise and fall of governments. The stakes were always high because these beings owned planets and controlled the lives of billions. Tonight they were discussing the humans who had just arrived at the station. A small delegation from Earth had come to negotiate trade agreements. The aliens found this very funny. Humans were new to the galaxy, and most species considered them barely evolved above animals. Captain Jake Morrison was leading the human delegation. He was a soldier from the Earth military, and he looked strong for a human. But 3 days ago he had collapsed during a meeting. The alien doctors said he was dying from Kethmaran plague. It was a disease that killed most species within a week. The aliens were taking bets on when exactly he would die. Zephyra sipped her drink and smiled like a predator. The liquid in her glass was blue and moved like it was alive. She had already won 2 small bets tonight, and she was feeling confident. Her fingers drummed on the table while she thought about what to wager next. Ambassador Kextala leaned forward on her coils. Her voice was like wind through dead leaves when she spoke. She said the humans were pathetic and weak. She said they would never survive in the real galaxy, where only the strong could live. She said Captain Morrison would be dead before the next solar cycle ended. Zephyra laughed, and the sound was like crystal breaking. She said humans were even weaker than the Sereth thought. She said she had studied their biology and found it laughable. Their bones were thin and their muscles were small. Their lifespans were short and their technology was primitive. She said Captain Morrison was probably already dead and his people were just too stupid to admit it. Lord Vexter slammed one of his massive fists on the table. The sound echoed through the gambling hall like thunder. He said he had fought humans in border skirmishes and found them disappointing. They died too easily, and they cried too much when they were hurt. He said he could kill 12 humans with his bare hands. The conversation turned to how much humans were worth as slaves. Zephyra said they were barely worth the cost of feeding. Them Kextala said their short lifespans made them poor investments. Baxter said they were too fragile for real work, but then Kextala said something that made everyone listen. She said she had heard rumors about human resilience, stories about humans surviving things that should have killed them. She said maybe the rumors were true, and maybe Captain Morrison would survive longer than expected. Zephyra laughed again, but this time there was anger in the sound. She said no human could survive Kethmaron plague. It had killed millions of beings, from hundreds of species. She said Kextala was being foolish and romantic about the primitive humans. The argument grew heated. Other gamblers at nearby tables stopped their own games to listen. Word began to spread through the hall that something big was about to happen. The kind of bet that people would talk about for years. Kextala coiled tighter, and her tongue flicked out faster. She said she was willing to put her money where her mouth was. She said she believed Captain Morrison might survive, and she was willing to bet on it. She offered her entire fleet of warships as collateral, 12 heavy cruisers and their crews, worth more than some star systems. Zephyra felt her pulse quicken. 12 warships would make her one of the most powerful beings in the sector. She could start her own empire with that kind of firepower. But what could she bet that would match such a huge wager? Her eyes turned to look at Lyra standing behind her chair. The elf girl was staring at nothing with her green eyes, empty of hope. Zephyra owned many valuable things, but nothing came close to Lyra. The elf was unique in the galaxy. Her healing powers were beyond anything science could create. Her beauty was legendary. Kings and emperors had offered entire planets just for one night with her. Zephyra had never considered risking Lyra in any bet. The elf was too valuable and too irreplaceable. But 12 warships was an offer that made her greedy heart race. She could always find other beautiful slaves, but she would never get another chance at a fleet like that. The other gamblers held their breath. They could see Zephyra thinking, and they knew something historic was about to happen. Bets like this were rare even in the high-stakes world of Nexus Prime. Fortunes were about to be won or lost on the life of a single dying human. Sephora stood up slowly. Her silver skin seemed to glow brighter as her excitement grew. She looked around the table, at all the watching faces. She looked at the crowds that had gathered to watch. She looked at Lyra, who still stared at nothing. She said she would match Kextala bet for bet. She would wager Lyra against the 12 warships. If Captain Morrison died within the solar cycle, then Kextala would hand over her entire fleet. If he lived longer than that, then Zephyra would give up her most precious possession. The gambling hall erupted in noise. Aliens shouted and cheered, and placed side bets on the main wager. News feeds began broadcasting the bet across the galaxy. Everyone wanted to know about the elf who had been risked on a dying human. Kextala smiled and showed her fangs. She said she accepted the terms. The bet was sealed with blood from both participants. Ancient tradition demanded that high-stakes wagers be bound with life force. Once the blood was mixed, there was no backing out. As the ceremony ended, Lyra finally moved. She turned her head just slightly to look at the human medical bay far below, through the transparent floor. Somewhere down there, Captain Morrison was fighting for his life. A man she had never met now held her fate in his hands. For the first time in 3 years, Lyra felt something other than despair. She felt the smallest spark of hope that maybe things could change. Maybe the universe was not as cold and cruel as she had learned. Maybe there was still magic in the galaxy that even her broken heart could believe in. The bet was made and broadcast across the stars. Now all they could do was wait and see if a dying human could do what no one thought possible: survive the unsurvivable, and change everything in the process. Deep in the medical bay of Nexus Prime, the machines beeped and hummed around Captain Jake Morrison's bed. His body lay still under white sheets that were stained with sweat and blood. The Kethmaron plague was eating him alive from the inside. His fever burned so hot that steam rose from his skin. Lieutenant Commander Amy Brooks sat beside his bed and refused to move. She had been there for 3 days straight. Her uniform was wrinkled, and her hair was messy, but she would not leave her captain alone. The alien medical staff kept telling her to give up. They said humans always died from this plague, and there was no point in wasting resources. Amy told them where they could put their medical advice. She had served with Jake for 5 years, and she knew he was tougher than any alien doctor believed. She had seen him survive things that should have killed him 10 times over. Explosions and radiation and poisons that liquefied organs. Jake always found a way to live through the impossible. Dr. Kate Phillips worked at the medical scanners nearby. She was the chief medical officer for the human delegation, and she had been studying the plague non-stop since Jake collapsed. The alien doctors had given her access to their medical database, but only because they found human attempts at medicine. Amusing. Kate ran test after test on blood samples from Jake. The plague was unlike anything in human medical knowledge. It attacked the nervous system and the immune system at the same time. It turned the body against itself and made every cell a battlefield. Most species died within hours of the first symptoms, but something strange was happening inside Jake that none of the alien doctors had noticed. The nanobots he had been injected with during his military service were still active in his bloodstream. They had been designed to repair battlefield injuries and boost immune responses. The alien doctors did not know about them because human medical technology was considered too primitive to worry about. The nanobots were trying to fight the plague, but they were losing badly. The alien disease was too advanced and too aggressive. But instead of shutting down like they were programmed to do, the nanobots began to adapt. They started copying parts of the plague and learning from it. Kate watched the readings with growing excitement. She could see the nanobots changing themselves in real time. They were becoming something new, something that had never existed before in any species. They were turning the plague from a weapon into a tool. Meanwhile, far above, in the observation deck, Lyra stood at the window and looked down at the medical bay. She could not see Jake directly, but her elf senses could feel his life force burning like a candle in a hurricane. She had felt many people die over the past 3 years. The feeling was always the same, like a light going out in the darkness. But Jake felt different. His life force was not fading like it should. Instead, it was fighting and changing and growing stronger. She had never felt anything like it in all her years of healing. It was as if his very soul refused to accept death. Zephyra noticed Lyra, staring down at the medical bay. The Valdorian woman walked over with her heels clicking on the metal floor. She grabbed Lyra's chin with one silver hand and forced the elf to look at her. Zephyra said she hoped Lyra was not getting any foolish ideas about the dying human. Lyra said nothing, but her green eyes burned with something that might have been defiance. Zephyra tightened her grip until it hurt. She reminded Lyra that slaves who disobeyed their masters faced punishments worse than death. She said that when Jake died and she won the bet, she would celebrate by making Lyra suffer for her insolence. But Lyra was not listening anymore. She had felt something impossible happen down in the medical bay. Jake's life force had just flared brighter, instead of dimmer. The plague that should have killed him was being turned into something else. Something that was making him stronger. Down in the medical bay, Kate stared at her scanners in disbelief. The readings made no sense according to everything she knew about biology. Jake's immune system was not just fighting the plague anymore. It was absorbing it and making it part of itself. The nanobots had figured out how to turn the alien disease into an upgrade for human biology. Jake began to move on his bed. His eyes fluttered open for the first time in 3 days. Amy grabbed his hand and felt his pulse. It was strong and steady instead of weak and racing. His fever was breaking, and his skin was returning to normal color. Jake tried to speak, but his throat was too dry. Amy gave him water, and he drank it slowly. His voice was rough when he finally managed to talk. He asked how long he had been unconscious. Amy told him 3 days, and he nodded like that was not very long at all. The alien medical staff gathered around his bed in confusion. They ran their own scans and could not believe what they were seeing. The plague was still in his system, but it was not killing him anymore. Instead, it seemed to be strengthening his cellular structure and boosting his neural activity. Dr. Kate ran more tests and discovered something incredible. Jake was not just immune to the plague now. He was immune to dozens of other alien diseases as well. His blood contained antibodies for infections that he had never been exposed to. The nanobots had used the plague as a template to create universal immunity. Word of Jake's recovery spread through the station like wildfire. Aliens who had been planning his funeral suddenly found themselves staring at medical readings that should not exist. The human who was supposed to die was not only alive but healthier than before. He got sick. In the gambling hall, Zephyra felt her confidence begin to crack. She had been celebrating early and planning what to do with 12 new warships. Now reports were coming in that made her silver skin turn pale. The human was not dying. He was getting better. Ambassador Kextala coiled tighter, and her tongue flicked out to taste the fear in the air. She had bet on human resilience, and it looked like she might win. 12 warships would make her one of the most powerful beings in the sector. But more than that, she would own the most beautiful slave in the galaxy. Lyra felt the change in the atmosphere around her. The aliens who had been ignoring her were now looking at her with new interest. They were calculating her value and planning how to use her if she changed hands. She had been property for 3 years, but somehow this felt different, more dangerous. Jake sat up in his bed and stretched muscles that felt stronger than they had ever been. He could see more clearly and hear sounds from farther away. His reflexes were faster and his mind was sharper. Whatever the plague had done, to him it had made him more than human. Amy briefed him on what had happened while he was unconscious. She told him about the bet that had been made on his life. Jake listened with growing anger. The idea that aliens would gamble with a sentient being's freedom made his enhanced blood boil with rage. Kate showed him the medical scans and explained what the nanobots had done. Jake was now effectively immune to most known diseases and poisons. His physical capabilities had been enhanced beyond normal human limits. His lifespan might have been extended by decades, or even centuries. But Jake was not thinking about his own changes. He was thinking about the elf girl, who had been wagered on his survival. He had heard stories about Lyra during the diplomatic meetings, how she had been stolen from her world and forced into slavery, how she was treated like a beautiful object instead of a living being. Jake stood up from his bed and felt power flowing through his enhanced muscles. He looked out the window toward the upper levels where the aliens were gambling. Somewhere up there was a girl who needed help, someone who had been used as a poker chip in a game between monsters. He told Amy to gather the rest of their team. They had work to do. The aliens thought they understood humans, but they were about to learn how wrong they were. Jake had not just survived their plague. He had been transformed by it into something they were not prepared to face. The bet had been about whether he would live or die. But Jake had decided there were more important things at stake than any wager. Things like freedom and dignity and the right of every thinking being to control their own destiny. As word of his recovery spread through the station, Jake could feel the alien confidence beginning to crack. They had underestimated humans once and barely noticed. Now they were about to underestimate humans again, and this time it would change everything. The solar cycle was not over yet. There was still time for more surprises. Jake Morrison had survived the impossible, and now he was ready to do something even more impossible. He was ready to challenge an entire galaxy built on slavery and suffering. The game was far from over. News of Jake Morrison recovery traveled through Nexus Prime faster than light particles. Alien nobles who had been planning victory celebrations suddenly found themselves staring at medical reports that made no sense. The human was not just alive, but stronger than before, enhanced beyond what their science said was possible. Lady Zephyra paced back and forth in her private chambers like a caged predator. Her silver skin had turned dark with rage, and her crystalline eyes blazed with fury. She had been so certain of victory that she had already started making plans for her new fleet. Now those plans were crashing down around her like a collapsing star. Lyra knelt in the corner of the room where Zephyra had thrown her after hearing the news. The elf girl bore fresh bruises on her pale skin from her master anger, but for the first time in 3 years she did not feel hopeless. The human had done something impossible. He had survived when everyone said he would die. Zephyra stopped pacing and turned to look at Lyra with eyes full of hatred. She said the bet was not over yet. There were still hours left in the solar cycle. Anything could happen to the human in that time. Accidents were common on space stations, especially to beings who made powerful enemies. She activated her communication device and began making calls to the most dangerous beings in the sector. Assassins and mercenaries who killed for money and pleasure. She offered them fortunes to eliminate one human before the solar cycle ended. She did not care how they did it, as long as Jake Morrison died. The first attempt came 2 hours later. A Catharian assassin known as Shadowblade materialized in the medical bay using advanced cloaking technology. His species could phase in and out of normal space, making them nearly impossible to detect or stop. He appeared behind Jake with energy blades extended toward his neck, but Jake's enhanced senses detected the disturbance in the air molecules. He spun around faster than any normal human could move and caught the assassin's wrist in his hand. His grip was strong enough to crush steel now. The Catharian bones snapped like dry wood. Amy Brooks was at Jake's side in seconds, with her weapon drawn. She had been expecting trouble ever since word of the bet reached their ears. The enhanced human tossed the assassin across the room where he hit the wall hard enough to leave a crater in the metal. Dr. Kate Phillips checked the assassin for life signs, while station security arrived to clean up the mess. She told them that Catharian would live, but he would never use those hands again. Jake had destroyed the nerve clusters that controlled his phasing ability. Zephyra received word of the failed assassination with growing panic. She immediately hired a team of Gorlak berserkers, known for their savage fighting skills and complete lack of mercy. They attacked Jake in the station corridors, using plasma weapons and explosive charges. The battle was over in minutes. Jake moved through the attackers like death itself. His enhanced reflexes let him dodge energy blasts that should have been impossible to avoid. His strength let him tear through armor that could stop starship weapons. When the smoke cleared, all 6 berserkers were down, and Jake did not have a scratch on him. Major Lisa Torres led the tactical response team that secured the area. She had served with Jake long enough to know he was dangerous, but his new capabilities were beyond anything she had imagined. She reported to Amy that their captain was now effectively a one-man army. The failed attacks only made Jake more determined to end the system that had created this situation. He could not stand the idea that sentient beings were treated as property, to be bought and sold and wagered on games. It went against everything he believed about dignity and freedom. Lieutenant Commander Beth Rodriguez worked at her communication station to broadcast Jake's recovery across the galaxy. She made sure every news service and information network knew that humans could survive what was supposed to be impossible. The message was clear. Underestimate humanity at your own risk. Ambassador Kexthala watched the failed assassination attempts with growing satisfaction. Her bet was looking more secure with each passing hour. Soon she would own the most beautiful and valuable slave in the known galaxy. She began making plans for how to use Lyra healing abilities for her own profit. But Jake had other ideas about Lyra's future. He studied the station legal databases and learned about the betting contract that bound her fate to his survival. The law was clear. If he lived past the solar cycle deadline, then ownership of Lyra would transfer to Kexthala. There was no provision for the slave to have any choice in the matter. Jake found this unacceptable. He had not survived alien plague and assassination attempts just to watch one monster trade an innocent girl to another monster. He began making his own plans for when the solar cycle ended. Dr. Kate made a discovery that changed everything. While studying Jake enhanced biology, she found that his new immune system could be replicated. His blood contained the template for universal immunity that could save billions of lives across the galaxy. He was not just a medical miracle, he was a medical revolution. The implications were staggering. Diseases that had killed entire civilizations could be cured with treatments derived from Jake blood. Plagues that had shaped galactic history for millennia could become nothing more than minor inconveniences. The knowledge locked in his enhanced DNA was worth more than all the wealth in the galaxy. Word of this discovery reached the alien nobility and changed the entire game. Suddenly Jake was not just a human who had survived longer than expected. He was the key to medical advances that could reshape civilization. Every government and corporation in the galaxy would want to control him. Zephyra realized that losing Lyra might be the least of her problems. If other factions decided they wanted Jake for their own purposes, then her assassination attempts might bring down the wrath of beings far more powerful than herself. She called off her remaining hired killers and tried to distance herself from the attacks. But Jake was not interested in forgiving or forgetting. He had been watching Lyra through the observation windows whenever possible. He could see the bruises on her skin and the emptiness in her eyes. He knew she was suffering because of the bet that had been made on his life. As the solar cycle deadline approached, Jake made his position clear to everyone who would listen. He announced that no sentient being could be considered property under any circumstances. He said that when the bet was resolved, he would not allow Lyra to simply change owners like a piece of furniture. The station authorities led by Captain Vexstar tried to intimidate Jake into accepting the legal transfer. They surrounded him with armed guards and threatened to arrest him for interfering with lawful commerce. They said slaves were legally recognized property, and his opinions about their rights were irrelevant. Jake looked at the corrupt station security forces with his enhanced eyes and saw fear hiding behind their threats. They knew he had torn through professional assassins without breaking a sweat. They knew their weapons might not be enough to stop him if he decided to fight. Amy Brooks and her team took positions around Jake, making it clear they would support their captain no matter what happened. They had sworn oaths to protect human dignity and freedom. They would not stand by and watch while an innocent being was traded between monsters. The deadline approached like an approaching storm. Aliens throughout the station gathered to watch what would happen when the solar cycle officially ended. Some came to see if the human would really try to challenge the fundamental laws of galactic society. Others came hoping to see him crushed by the system that had ruled the galaxy for thousands of years. Lyra watched from her position beside Zephyra's throne. She could feel the tension building like electricity in the air before lightning strikes. Everything was about to change. The question was whether it would change for better or worse. Jake stood in the center of the gambling hall, surrounded by hundreds of alien beings who considered him either a medical miracle or a dangerous revolutionary. His enhanced senses could detect the fear and anger and greed radiating from the crowd. They were waiting to see if one human could really challenge an entire galaxy. The solar cycle ended with a chime that echoed through the station. According to the terms of the bet, Jake Morrison had survived longer than anyone thought possible. Kekstala had won her wager. Lyra now belonged to her, but Jake Morrison had other plans for what happened next. The chime that marked the end of the solar cycle echoed through the gambling hall like a death knell. Ambassador Kekstala uncoiled her serpentine body and rose to her full height, with triumph gleaming in her reptilian eyes. According to Galactic law, Lyra now belonged to her. The most beautiful and valuable slave in the sector was hers to command. But Jake Morrison stepped forward before anyone could move to claim the elf girl. His enhanced voice carried clearly through the massive chamber as he spoke words that would echo across the galaxy. He said that no sentient being could be owned by another under any circumstances. He said that slavery was an abomination that had no place in civilized society. The alien nobles erupted in shocked laughter. They could not believe that a single human thought he could challenge laws that had existed for thousands of years. Slavery was the foundation of galactic economy. Without it, entire civilizations would collapse. Trillions of beings depended on slave labor for their way of life. Sephora pointed one silver finger at Jake and declared him insane. She said humans were too primitive to understand how advanced societies functioned. She said that some beings were naturally superior, while others were meant to serve. It was the natural order of the universe. Jake looked around the hall at hundreds of alien faces filled with arrogance and cruelty. These beings thought they were gods who could decide the fate of other thinking creatures. They had built their wealth and power on the suffering of the innocent. They needed to learn that times were changing. He walked over to where Lyra knelt beside Sephora's throne. The elf girl looked up at him with eyes that held the first spark of hope she had felt in 3 years. Jake extended his hand to her and spoke, in a voice that everyone could hear. He told her that she was free. No matter what any law or contract said, she was a person with the right to choose her own destiny. Lyra stared at his outstretched hand, like it was a miracle she was afraid to touch. For 3 years she had been treated as property. She had been bought and sold and wagered like a beautiful object. No one had ever asked what she wanted or cared about her feelings. Now this human was offering her something she had thought was lost forever. She reached out and took his hand. The moment their skin touched, she felt a jolt of energy pass between them. Her elf magic responded to something in his enhanced biology. She could sense the nanobots in his bloodstream and the plague, antibodies that had made him more than human. He was as changed as she was, but in different ways. Captain Vexstar and his security forces moved to surround Jake and Lyra. The corrupt station commander ordered them to step away from each other and submit to galactic law. He said that interfering with legal property transfer was a serious crime. He threatened to arrest the entire human delegation. Amy Brooks and her team immediately formed a protective circle around Jake and Lyra. They drew their weapons and made it clear they would fight, before letting their captain be arrested. Major Lisa Torres activated the tactical protocols that would turn any battle into a coordinated military operation. But Jake raised his hand to stop his people from firing. He had a better idea than starting a gunfight in the gambling hall. He looked around at all the aliens watching and spoke directly to the slaves standing behind their masters' chairs. Most beings in the hall had never really noticed them before, but they were everywhere. Jake told the slaves that they outnumbered their masters by 10 to 1. He told them that they had rights that no law could take away. He told them that freedom was not something that could be given or taken by others. It was something that belonged to every thinking being from the moment they were born. For a moment, nothing happened. The slaves looked at each other with confusion and fear. They had been conditioned from birth to obey their masters without question. The idea of resistance was so foreign that many could not even understand what Jake was suggesting. But then Lyra stepped forward and spoke for the first time in years. Her voice was like music after long silence. She told her fellow slaves that she had felt what freedom looked like when Jake took her hand. She told them that they deserved better than lives spent in chains and collars and cages. A slave near the back of the hall was the first to move. He had been forced to carry his master palanquin for 20 years. His back was bent from the weight, and his hands were scarred from the chains. But when he heard Lyra speak, something awakened in his heart that had been sleeping for decades. He dropped the palanquin with a crash that echoed through the hall. His master tumbled to the floor in an undignified heap and began screaming threats and curses. But the Centaurian was no longer listening. He was looking at his hands and realizing they belonged to him. The moment was like a spark hitting dry, kindling. Slaves throughout the hall began to stir and move and remember what it felt like to make their own choices. A Dilan kitchen worker threw down the tray she had been carrying. A Vorthok translator stopped, repeating his master words, and spoke his own thoughts for the first time in years. The alien nobles began to panic as they realized what was happening. Their property was coming alive around them. Beings they had never thought of as people were suddenly acting like people. The natural order of their universe was collapsing before their eyes. Some masters tried to activate punishment collars and control devices, but Dr. Kate Phillips had been busy while everyone was watching the main drama. She had used her medical knowledge in Jake-enhanced blood to create a universal signal disruptor. Every control device in the hall shut down at the same moment. What followed was not really a battle. It was more like an awakening. Hundreds of slaves who had never dared to dream of freedom suddenly found themselves able to choose their own actions. Some ran for the exits. Others confronted their former masters. Many just stood in place and cried as they felt emotions they had forgotten they were allowed to have. Amy Brooks coordinated the human response with military precision. Her people moved through the chaos to protect freed slaves and disable alien weapons. They had trained for urban combat, but never imagined they would be fighting to liberate an entire station. Lieutenant Commander Beth Rodriguez used her communication equipment to broadcast everything that was happening across the galaxy. She made sure every news network and information service knew that humanity had sparked a slave revolt on Nexus Prime. The message would reach 100 worlds within hours. The station's security forces found themselves overwhelmed by sheer numbers. Captain Vexstar had a few hundred armed guards, but there were thousands of newly freed slaves throughout the station. Many had spent years learning the layout, while performing maintenance and service jobs. They knew every corridor and ventilation shaft. Major Lisa Torres led tactical squads to secure key areas like the power generators and communication arrays. She had studied the station blueprints and identified choke points where small forces could control large areas. Her people moved like ghosts through the maintenance tunnels. Zephyra tried to escape to her private ship, but found her way blocked by former slaves who remembered every cruelty she had inflicted. They did not hurt her, but they would not let her pass. She found herself trapped in a crowd of beings she had never considered worthy of her attention. Ambassador Kekstala attempted to rally other alien nobles to organize resistance, but discovered that most were too busy trying to save their own lives. The careful hierarchy that had ruled the galaxy for millennia was falling apart in a matter of hours. Jake and Lyra moved through the chaos like the eye of a hurricane. Wherever they went, newly freed slaves gathered around them. Jake spoke to them about dignity and rights, while Lyra used her healing abilities to tend wounds both old and new. Together they became symbols of what freedom could look like. The fighting spread throughout Nexus Prime, as word of the rebellion reached other levels. Slaves in the factories and mines and service sectors heard what was happening and decided they wanted freedom too. What had started as one human challenging a bet became a galaxy-wide revolution. Dr. Kate worked frantically to treat injured rebels, while also studying the alien medical databases. She discovered that many species had been deliberately weakened by their masters through drugs and genetic manipulation. She began developing treatments to restore their natural strength and intelligence. As the night wore on, it became clear that the old order was dying. Too many slaves had tasted freedom to ever go back to chains. Too many had heard Jake Morrison say that every thinking being deserved dignity. The revolution had reached a tipping point where it could not be stopped, but victory was coming at a terrible price. Many brave beings died fighting for their freedom. Others were killed by masters who preferred to destroy their property rather than lose it. The cost of liberation was being paid in blood throughout the station. Jake stood in the central plaza surrounded by thousands of newly freed beings from dozens of species. His enhanced voice carried to every corner as he spoke about the future. They could build together, a future where no one would be property, and everyone would have the right to choose their own path. The revolution was far from over, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Humanity had lit a fire that would burn across the galaxy. The age of slavery was ending, and a new age of freedom was about to begin. 3 weeks after the revolution began, Nexus Prime had transformed into something the galaxy had never seen before. The massive trade station that had once been a symbol of alien wealth and power was now a beacon of hope for every enslaved being in known space. Ships arrived daily, carrying refugees who had heard about the place where freedom was more than just a dream. Jake Morrison stood on the observation deck that had once been reserved for alien nobility and watched another convoy of refugee ships dock at the station. His enhanced senses could detect the hope and fear radiating from the new arrivals. They had traveled across the galaxy seeking the freedom that humans had promised, but they were not sure it was real. Lyra worked beside him, coordinating the medical teams that treated each new group of refugees. Her healing abilities had grown stronger since gaining her freedom, as if liberty itself had unlocked hidden depths of her magic. She could now heal wounds that had been considered permanent and restore hope to hearts that had been broken for decades. The transformation had not come without cost. The central plaza bore memorial walls covered with the names of beings who had died fighting for freedom. Amy Brooks had insisted that every sacrifice be remembered and honored. She said that forgetting the price of liberty was the first step toward losing it again. Dr. Kate Phillips worked in the medical centers that had been converted from slave-holding facilities. She had developed treatments that could reverse years of genetic manipulation and chemical conditioning. Beings who had been deliberately weakened by their masters were discovering strength they never knew they possessed. The work was exhausting, but incredibly rewarding. Every day brought new discoveries about the true potential of species that had been suppressed for generations. It turned out that many of the galaxy's so-called inferior races were actually quite capable when given proper nutrition and medical care. Major Lisa Torres commanded the security forces that protected the station from increasingly desperate attempts by the old powers to retake control. 3 times alien fleets had tried to assault Nexus Prime. 3 times they had been driven off by defenders who fought with the fury of beings protecting their newfound freedom. The victories had not been easy. The revolution had spread to hundreds of worlds, but it was far from complete. Vast areas of the galaxy remained under the control of the old slave-owning powers. They were organizing a massive counterattack that could destroy everything the rebels had built. Lieutenant Commander Beth Rodriguez maintained the communication networks that connected free worlds across the galaxy. Her broadcasts had inspired slave revolts on distant planets and provided coordination for rebel movements that had never been able to work together before. The political situation was incredibly complex. The Galactic Council had declared the human delegation to be criminals and terrorists. They demanded that Jake Morrison be handed over for trial, along with all the other leaders of the rebellion. They offered massive rewards for information leading to the capture of the human who had started it all. But Jake was no longer thinking like a military officer, following orders from distant superiors. He was thinking like a leader responsible for the lives and dreams of millions of beings who had chosen to follow him. The weight of that responsibility was heavier than any burden he had carried before. Ambassador Kekstala had been captured during the early days of the fighting, and was now held in one of the station's detention centers. She spent her time writing legal briefs demanding that her property rights be respected. She insisted that Lyra still belonged to her. According to the terms of the original bet, Jake visited her cell one morning to explain why her legal arguments were meaningless. He told her that the old laws had been written by slave owners to protect slave owners. Free beings would write new laws based on different principles, laws that recognized the fundamental dignity of every thinking creature. Kexala listened with growing horror as Jake described the society they were building, a place where no one could own another person regardless of species or technology level, a place where strength was measured by how well you protected the weak rather than how brutally you exploited them. She said it would never work. She said that different species had different capabilities and natural roles. She said that chaos would result if the natural hierarchy was destroyed. She said that some beings were meant to serve, while others were meant to rule. Jake looked at her with eyes that had seen both the worst and best that sentient beings were capable of. He told her that every tyrant in history had used the same arguments to justify their cruelty. They always claimed their victims deserved their suffering. They always insisted that oppression was natural and necessary. The real test of the new order came when ships arrived carrying former slave owners who wanted to negotiate the return of their property. They offered huge sums of money and valuable technology in exchange for the beings they considered their rightful possessions. The free council that had formed to govern the station faced its first major decision. Some members argued that they needed resources to build their new society and could not afford to turn down valuable offers. Others insisted that any compromise with slavery would destroy everything they were fighting for. Jake addressed the council meeting where the decision would be made. He spoke about the moment when he had taken Lyra's hand and offered her freedom. He said that choice had defined who they were as a movement. They were beings who believed that freedom could not be bought or sold or negotiated away. Lyra also spoke to the council. She described what it felt like to be treated as property for 3 years. She talked about the emptiness that came from having no control over your own life. She said that any being who had experienced that emptiness would understand why freedom could never be compromised. The vote was unanimous. No former slave would be returned to their masters under any circumstances. No amount of money or technology was worth betraying the principles they had fought and died to establish. The station would remain a sanctuary for any being seeking freedom regardless of the consequences. The decision sent shockwaves across the galaxy. It meant that the rebellion was serious about creating a new kind of civilization. It meant that the old powers would have to choose between accepting change or destroying what they could not control. Dr. Kate made another breakthrough in her research that changed everything yet again. She discovered that Jake-enhanced immunity could be partially transferred to other species through carefully designed treatments. It would not make them superhuman like him, but it would protect them from many of the diseases that slave owners used to control their populations. The implications were staggering. One of the primary tools of oppression was about to become useless. Slave owners often used biological weapons to keep their property weak and dependent. If that was no longer possible, then the balance of power would shift dramatically. Amy Brooks organized the distribution of the immunity treatments to refugee populations throughout the station. She insisted that everyone receive the protection regardless of their species or background. She said that freedom meant nothing if you could be killed by diseases that your former masters were immune to. The work brought Jake and Lyra closer together as they labored side by side to build something that had never existed before. A society based on cooperation instead of domination. A place where beings from different worlds could work together as equals. Their partnership became a symbol of what the new galaxy could look like. A human who had been enhanced by alien technology, working with an elf whose magic had been unlocked by human concepts of freedom. Together they represented the potential for all species to grow stronger through cooperation. Ships continued to arrive, carrying more refugees and more stories of successful revolts on distant worlds. Each success made the old powers more desperate and more dangerous, but it also made the dream of galactic freedom more real. The memorial walls in the central plaza grew longer as the cost of revolution continued to mount, but alongside the names of the dead were lists of worlds that had been liberated and species that had been freed. The price was terrible, but the progress was undeniable. Jake stood once again on the observation deck and watched the latest group of refugee ships dock at their growing sanctuary. Lyra joined him, as she always did, when the day work was finished. Together they looked out at the stars and planned for a future that neither of them could have imagined just a few weeks ago. The galaxy was changing. It was becoming a place where a dying human could survive the impossible and an enslaved elf could discover her true power. A place where freedom was not just a word, but a reality that could be built one choice at a time. The revolution was far from over, but its ultimate victory was no longer in doubt. Too many beings had tasted freedom to ever accept chains again. Too many had heard the message that Jake Morrison and Lyra had carried across the stars. The message that every thinking being deserved dignity and hope and the right to choose their own destiny. They had wagered everything on the belief that freedom was worth any price. Now they knew they had bet on the right side of history.